Hi guys, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria. So this is a relatively simple point, but something that's come up recently in some comments I've noticed made to certain videos that I and other people in HEMA have put up. And this is really coming from the kind of sport fencing background, and there seems to be a misunderstanding, shall we say, from I won't say many, but a few sport fencers in the nature of the hits that are given in HEMA fencing bouts compared to what sport fencers are used to. And the simple fact is that if we're looking at most HEMA systems, small sword aside, most of them are cut and thrust systems. Now a thrust, to push a thrust into a person's body, is pretty much the same with a real sword as it is with a foil or an epee or a sabre in modern sport fencing. It just requires essentially a relatively small amount of pressure given in usually a straight line, sometimes a curved line. And it doesn't really require much force at all. However, when you come to cuts, it's an entirely different thing. And in modern sports sabre fencing, generally speaking, the cuts given are of a flicky, hitty nature that wouldn't really work with a real sword. Why don't they work with a real sword? Well, there are a couple of main reasons. One, there's the fact that you're not impacting with enough energy on the target, and equally it tends to be given as a perpendicular sort of strike, perpendicular to the target, a tap essentially. Now there are essentially three ways you can cut with a real sword. You can either move the sword through the air with a lot of speed and force, such that when it hits the target it cleaves like an axe does into a tree. Okay, and this is a perfectly effective type of cut and was the predominant type of cut given in most European systems. Okay, now to give a cut like this, you can cut from the wrist, that is the motion coming from the wrist, or you can move with the elbow and the wrist, or you can move with the shoulder, the elbow and the wrist. You've only got 3 joints in your arm, assuming it's a one-handed sword. If it's a two-handed sword, you've got the push and pull on the hilt of the weapon as well, which adds a hell of a lot more speed and leverage and ability to reload the weapon as well. But essentially what you're doing is you're accelerating the tip of the weapon so it's moving at speed. And of course you have to remember that there's mass to this weapon. So this here is a small sword bladed sword. If we're talking about a real cut and thrust sword, a sabre, these weigh around 800 to 1,000 grams for a sabre, for a military sabre, compared to about 400 grams for a modern sports sabre. And even more importantly than that, whilst the weight is twice as much as a modern fencing sabre, the weight distribution in the weapon is entirely different, and obviously the real sabre has most of its mass in the blade. In actual fact, a modern sport fencing sabre has most of its mass in the hilt. So what they've essentially done with the modern sport fencing sabre is they've kept a hilt which weighs a bit less, but they've got a blade which weighs a lot less, and that's why the total weight is half as much. But that belies the fact and hides the fact that actually all of the mass is basically in the hilt. Whereas with a real sword that's designed to cut, you have a lot of inertia out in the blade. You have a lot of material in the blade which you have to deliver to the target. Now if you're giving this perpendicular type of chop, you have to load and unload that weapon in a certain way. And this generally means either bringing the point back a fair bit and applying the different joints and muscles of your arm in accelerating it forward, or it means moving the sword in a circular motion known as a moulinet to power the cut. Okay, so this is the first point, and the second point is that, as I've mentioned, the mass of the weapon is totally different. So to conclude, one of the misconceptions that seems to be coming from some sport fencers when watching HEMA videos is that they seem to think that we're striking each other in an inefficient way, or we're moving more than we need to. And the very simple fact is, unless you've tried to use historical weapons, you probably don't realise this. So I'm here to tell you, if you're trying to cut something, first of all you have to either chop push cut or draw cut. Okay, so to cut something is not the same as tapping it. Tapping it and making an electrical circuit in modern sport sabre fencing is entirely different to actually trying to cut something with a sabre. And secondly, when you have a weapon that has that much more material in the blade, you have to move it differently. You have to accelerate it, and to accelerate it, you can't just make a little flicking action like you can with a modern sports sabre and expect it to have any effect whatsoever on the opponent. It won't. Okay, you have to move the weapon and accelerate it in such a way that requires different style of body movement, and yeah, it takes longer because the weapon weighs more, and your body has not just weighs more but has a lot more inertia in the blade, and you have to put acceleration into that, or indeed to give a push cut or a draw cut. So it's a very, very different thing. So as always, I try not to judge other sports or other martial arts by a narrow point of view that I come from. I'm sure that sometimes I'm guilty of bias and not seeing outside of my kind of blinkered view. But when you're viewing HEMA or historical fencing videos using real weight swords to hit each other, don't view it from a sport fencing standpoint of using incredibly light weapons to tap each other, because we only count hits that would wound with real sharp weapons in a real fight. So if I go into a military fencing, historical fencing bout with sabre, and I do that to someone, I am not going to score a point. Okay, or at least under most rule sets that I've ever fenced under and under tournaments I've run, that would never ever score a point. I have to hit the person in a way that would actually have a real effect in so-called real life. Okay, so there we go. Hits in historical fencing should be viewed very, very differently and from a very different standpoint to how you view hits being scored in modern sport fencing. Cheers, guys.